Next, we're going to talk about what has been, what is, and what always will be the most important statistical technique ever: regression. Almost every analysis you will read or see uses regression in some way or another. So let's talk about that. Now, there are two ways of viewing regression. One is descriptive, and the second is causal. So we're going to start with the descriptive approach. That's simply, regression is a way of viewing correlations in the data. So let's look at an example. Let's think about the effect of property rights on economic development. What's the causal effect? So here I'm asking, if I were to intervene today and go to every country and increase their property rights somehow, make their property rights stronger, what would be the average change in economic development? For example, would GDP go up everywhere? Now, this question is what Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson looked at in 2001 in their paper in the American Economic Review. Now, this paper is very well known and is mainly an application of instrumental variables, which we'll talk about later on. But here I want to just start by seeing how they use regression as a description of their data. So in their data, each unit is a country. So each country is going to have a different level of property rights and of economic growth. They're going to measure property rights with a variable called protection against expropriation risk. This variable is going to take on the values 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., up to 10, where 10 is having strong property rights. Okay, so there's a lot of protection against your property being expropriated from you by the government or somebody else. And 0 is going to be very weak rights, meaning you don't have a lot of protection against your property being expropriated from. That's how they're going to measure property rights. Second, they're going to measure economic development by GDP, gross domestic product per capita or per person. So let's look at the data. So here, they've plotted all the data. Each point here is a different country. So up here you see we've got USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Down here we have Sudan, Haiti, and Mali. Okay? On the vertical axis, we have log GDP per capita, 1995. So that's economic growth. Okay, that's what's being measured on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, it says average expropriation risk, 1985 through 95. Okay, editorial typo here. They really mean average protection against expropriation risk. So higher numbers are stronger property rights, like I just talked about earlier. Lower numbers are lower property rights. So over here, we have a lot of very high property rights, and then up here, we have very high economic growth. So that's USA, Canada, Australia, for example, have high economic growth and high property rights. Down here, we have countries with lower property rights and lower economic growth, countries like Sudan and Haiti. And you can see that there seems to be this relationship. Countries with higher economic growth have more property rights. And then here in this one little line, we've drawn something called the regression line. And that just summarizes what we see visually with the data. There seems to be this relationship between having high property rights and having high economic development. Now, formally, we could say that the regression of GDP per capita on expropriation risk shows a positive relationship. Okay? The more protection you have of your property rights, the higher your GDP per capita is. A different way of saying this is that a regression of GDP per capita on protection against expropriation yields a positive coefficient on protection against expropriation or on property rights. So basically, we're just saying that we've got some data on countries, on their outcome variable and on their treatment variable. And in the data, these two variables are positively correlated. That's all regression is telling us. We're describing the correlations in the data. Now, we all know from the earlier modules that correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation. So although we see in the data by doing regression analysis that there is this correlation, it doesn't tell us that if we were to intervene and increase property rights in countries, that would cause GDP to increase. And why is that? Now, the same reasons we've talked about before. There could be a confounding variable. There could be another variable that's actually having a causal effect on economic development and happens to be correlated with property rights. And the correlation we're seeing in our regression analysis in the data is just picking up this confounder. For example, maybe what matters is how leaders are chosen. So suppose that democratic countries have higher economic development than dictatorships. Well, if democracy is also correlated with having high property rights, then this relationship we see in the data might not be a causal effect of property rights on economic development. It might be reflecting a causal effect of democracy on economic development. But we haven't included that confounding variable in the analysis. Okay, so that could be driving everything we're seeing in the regression. Now, there's another new possibility that we haven't talked about before. So we've talked about confounders, but another possibility here is something called reverse causality. What if strong property rights are actually a consequence of high economic development? So it's not that having property rights increases economic development, it's the other way around. Having strong economic development increases property rights. For example, maybe rich countries can afford to protect property rights, to pay for police and the judicial system, etc., to make sure that people are secure in what they own. If this is a problem, then again, we can't figure out the direction of causality from just looking at the data from the regression analysis, from just this correlation we see between property rights and economic development. A more general problem that's even more difficult is that we may have something called simultaneity. This happens when both directions of causality are happening at the same time. Not only are property rights affecting economic development, but economic development is affecting property rights, both directions. Now, this is a difficult problem, and to tackle it, we'll have to use a different technique later on. But here, I just want to say that regression is a way to summarize the data and to just look at the correlations we see. That's the descriptive approach to using regression.